Okay, we're ready for the specialized techniques of watercolor painting. We're going to start with a flat wash, then a wet on wet, then some glazing, and a special technique. And for this one, I recommend you use whatever you have handy. You can use salt, you can use regular rubbing alcohol, or these days I think everybody probably has access to hand sanitizer, which has a lot of alcohol in it. So hand sanitizer would work fine as well. So take a minute and grab those things and then come back and let's start with a flat wash. For the flat wash, I just want you to choose two colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. And I'm going to choose some colors that I already have mixed on my palette. So I'm going to go with some green and blue. Put a little bit more green on my lid, a little bit more blue. Okay, so a flat wash means you're not, basically it means you're not going to wet the paper before you start. And this allows you to have a little bit more control, and it also allows you to get a slightly darker value of the color. So I'm still going to let it be nice and wet, and I'm working quickly so it doesn't have a chance to dry. And I'm going to put the green right next to it, and I'm going to overlap them. And this is going to give me a nice gradient from green to blue, hopefully. And you can feather your brush back and forth where the colors overlap to kind of help them mix together just a little bit more. And it's kind of just going to be a flat wash. You could do this with a solid color, or you can mix more than one, more than one or two colors together. I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to move this. And I'm going to go into the glazing box next. Glazing is basically when you overlap colors, but you let them dry in between the overlapping. So what I want you to do inside this box is to just do a stripe. It can either be horizontal or vertical stripe. Any color that you want that is a primary color. I'm going to pick yellow. So very gently, I'm going to load some yellow on my brush. And I'm just going to do a little tiny bit of a wavy, but mostly horizontal. Okay, and I'm going to leave that alone for a few minutes and let that get dry while I go do some other techniques. Okay, so in the glazing box, just one little stripe of any primary color, it's up to you. And then I'm going to go up into the wet in wet box while I'm waiting for this yellow stripe to dry. Wet and wet means that you're adding wet paint onto a wet surface. So you're going to start by having a nice wet, clear, clean, wet background or a first layer. If you have a very, very big, huge puddle and you overdid it, you can soak some of it up with paper towel or some kind of a cloth or sponge. Or you can blow dry it just a tiny bit. So it should be a little shiny, but there shouldn't be any puddles standing. Okay, again, I want you to pick two colors that are pretty close to each other on the color wheel. So I'm gonna go with some purple. And again, you want to work a little bit quickly and in small sections. And I'm going to stay away from the green because it's a little bit wet still, and I don't want those two colors to bleed into each other because they will not be pretty. All right, so as you can see, it's already bleeding because of the clear water background. Okay, I'm going to wash my brush, and real quick, I'm gonna grab some red, just a little red, And where I drop these next to each other, they're already going to bleed into each other because of the fact that the paper is already wet. This is particularly useful when you're painting sky and water. Okay, and then I'm gonna wash my brush and throw a couple of little last minute dots of black just to see what happens. Just a little experiment. And I'm gonna leave a little bit of it. So I'm going to dab some black around different spots so that it'll just all bleed together. Even after I walk away, this paint is still going to be doing some interacting. And by the time I come back, it'll look even more different than it does right now. Okay, I'm going to let that dry. And let's talk about your special technique. So special technique is a way of getting texture in your artwork. So I can show you my example. If you use salt, you would do any one of either the flat wash or the wet on wet. And while it's still very wet, you would sprinkle salt on the wet paint. And after it dries, it has this kind of very texturized look to it. I always use salt, so I'm going to try something a little different today. I'm going to use hand sanitizer. So I got my hand sanitizer and a Q-tip. So I'm ready. And I'm going to put a wet on wet wash there, which means I'm going to start with a nice wet surface with just clean water. Making sure that it's really wet, but it's not creating any big puddle. All right, and I'm going to use some dark colors. So I'm going to put some blue. And I'm going to wash my brush. And I'm going to scoop up some green. And while that's still wet, I'm going to squirt some hand sanitizer in my palm. I'm going to roll the Q-tip around, and I'm just going to drop a little bit of the hand sanitizer here and there. You can see this. You could use a paintbrush if you wanted some smaller dots. And what's happening is the alcohol is causing the watercolor paint to just separate, move away from the alcohol. So it's just kind of a cool way to create some snow, rain, fog, or ripples in the water. Like I could do this in a more of a ripply way to create ripples on the water. So it's just a good way to create a little extra texture. And then I'm gonna wipe the rest of this off with my cloth. And now I'm ready to show you glazing. So again, I'm gonna make sure my brush is really dry, really washed, not dry. And I'm gonna overlap in this glazing box with some colors so that you can see how the colors change. Oops. So this is wet on dry. This is also a little bit of sumi-e painting technique. So any colors that you mix with yellow, you're gonna see how they look when they overlap with the yellow. Because watercolor paint is meant to be transparent, so you should be able to see a change in the colors when you do some glazing. So I'm gonna start with a color that's gonna easily blend with the yellow, and that's going to be green. So I'm putting some green on my brush. I'm also going to roll the tip of my brush around on the plastic palette until I make my brush very pointy so that I can have a lot of control. This is how you create details. So you can see that my green is a lot darker when it's just on the paper and lighter where it overlaps the yellow. I'm gonna wash my brush out and I'm gonna load a little bit of red. And I'm gonna do the same thing. Just gonna roll my brush on the tip, trying to make it as pointy as I can. Wash my brush. Watch what happens when I use purple. Purple and yellow are complementary, meaning that they're across from each other on the color wheel. So when they overlap, it creates kind of almost a brown. So you can see where the line of yellow sort of stops right there. And where those two colors overlap, it creates almost a brownish, muddy color. Okay, and let's try one more. You can use whatever colors you want. You don't have to use the same colors that I've used. But I think I'm just gonna use some orange. So again, I'm going to roll the tip of my brush to make it pointy. And I have a little bit of you can see a little difference right there where the yellow meets the orange. Okay, and that's it. We're gonna let that dry, and then we're gonna put all of these techniques into actual work on the bottom half of this paper and create a little rough draft of a landscape.